Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the mighty battleship Yamato, watching the vast expanse of the Pacific stretch endlessly before him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck as the combined fleet prepared for what would become the most decisive naval engagement in the Pacific theater. Yamamoto's weathered face betrayed none of the uncertainty gnawing at his strategic mind, though his fingers drummed against the railing, a tell his subordinates had learned to recognize over months of preparation. The Japanese high command had grown intoxicated by their string of victories. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, each triumph had fed an increasingly dangerous sense of invincibility. Now they sought to deliver a knockout blow that would bring the Americans to their knees and secure Japan's Pacific Empire forever. The target, Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand that served as America's westernmost outpost. Admiral, called Captain Taijiro Aoki, approaching with the latest intelligence reports clutched in his hands. Our agents in Hawaii report minimal American fleet movements. The enemy appears to be taking our Aleutian feint seriously. Yamamoto nodded, though something troubled him about the ease with which their deception seemed to be working. The plan was elegant in its complexity. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American forces north, leaving Midway vulnerable to capture. Once they held the atoll, the Americans would have no choice but to launch a desperate counterattack with their remaining carriers, straight into the waiting guns of the combined fleet. According to declassified U.S. Navy records from the National Archives, Japanese naval intelligence had significantly underestimated American code-breaking capabilities during this period. What Yamamoto and his staff didn't know was that Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had been reading their naval codes for months. Every detail of Operation MI, the Japanese code name for the Midway assault, was being transmitted directly to Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. The Americans knew about the Aleutian diversion, they knew about the planned invasion date, and most critically, they knew exactly where the Japanese carriers would be positioned. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack, commanded the first carrier striking force from the flight deck of the Akagi. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation. Their pilots were veterans of campaigns across the Pacific, men who had honed their skills in the crucible of actual combat. Nagumo himself was confident, perhaps overconfident, in their abilities. The Japanese plan called for Nagumo's carriers to soften up Midway's defenses with a devastating aerial bombardment, clearing the way for the invasion force under Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka. Meanwhile, Yamamoto's main body, including the massive Yamato, would hang back to the northwest, ready to engage and destroy any American fleet that dared to challenge them. As the sun climbed higher on the morning of June 3, 1942, the various elements of the Japanese fleet moved inexorably toward their destiny. In the radio rooms of the carriers, operators maintained strict communication discipline, unaware that every position report and weather observation was being intercepted and decoded by their enemies. The trap they believed they were setting had become the very snare that would catch them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the Pacific War and demonstrate the fatal consequences of underestimating one's opponent. The pre-dawn. Darkness of June 4, 1942, hung heavy over the Pacific as Vice Admiral Nagumo's carriers sliced through the swells at 24 knots. On the hangar decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, flight crews made final preparations for what they assumed would be another routine bombardment mission. The target was tiny Midway Atoll, lying 250 miles ahead in the gray, morning haze. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga, leading the first wave of 108 bombers and fighters, had already received his briefing. His orders were simple: neutralize Midway's airfield and soften its defenses for the invasion force following behind. As the carriers turned into the wind at 0400 hours, the rhythmic thunder of aircraft engines filled the air. One by one, the planes launched into the darkness, their navigation lights disappearing as they formed up and headed southeast toward their target. What Tominaga and his pilots didn't know was that Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 16 and Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher's Task Force 17 were already positioned northeast of Midway, having departed Pearl Harbor days earlier based on Rochefort's intelligence breakthrough. The Americans had achieved what military theorists call the ultimate advantage. They knew exactly where their enemy would be, while remaining invisible themselves. At 0530 hours, as the first Japanese aircraft appeared over Midway, the island's radar operators had been tracking them for over an hour. Marine Fighter Squadron 221, flying obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats, scrambled to intercept. Major Floyd Parks led his pilots into what would be a one-sided slaughter. The Japanese Zero fighters easily outclassed the American aircraft, shooting down 15 of the 26 defenders. This account draws from the official U.S. Marine Corps historical records maintained at Quantico, which document the heroic but futile resistance of the Marine aviators. Despite the air battle's outcome, the Marines had achieved something crucial. They had forced the Japanese to use their precious Zeros in combat, reducing the number available to protect the carriers. Moreover, Tominaga's bombing attack, while destructive, had failed to completely neutralize Midway's airfield. As his aircraft limped back toward the carriers, Tominaga radioed a message that would prove fatal. There is need for a second attack wave. Admiral Nagumo faced a dilemma. His remaining aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes configured for anti-ship warfare in case American naval forces appeared. Tominaga's request meant rearming them with high-explosive bombs suitable for land targets, a time-consuming process that would leave his carriers vulnerable. At 0715 hours, Nagumo made his decision. Begin rearming for a second strike on Midway. Unknown to the Japanese admiral, American scout planes had already spotted his fleet. At 0552 hours, Ensign Jack Reed, flying a PBY Catalina from Midway, had transmitted the electrifying message. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150. 20 minutes later came an even more crucial sighting. Two carriers and main body ships, carriers in front, course 135, speed 25. The moment Admiral Spruance received this intelligence, he made one of the most audacious decisions in naval history. Rather than waiting for his scouts to locate all the Japanese carriers, he would launch immediately with everything he had. At 0706 hours, the Enterprise and Hornet began launching their entire air groups, a total of 116 aircraft racing toward the Japanese fleet. As the American planes disappeared over the horizon, Nagumo's carriers continued their deadly routine of rearming aircraft, completely unaware that retribution was already airborne and closing fast. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning haze and revealing a day that would be remembered as one of the most decisive in naval warfare. The hangar decks of the Japanese carriers had become scenes of controlled chaos as hundreds of ordnance. Crews worked frantically to rearm the aircraft for Tominaga's requested second strike on Midway. On the Akagi's flight deck, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, hero of Pearl Harbor, watched with growing unease as precious minutes ticked away. His aviators, the elite of Japanese naval aviation, stood ready beside their aircraft. But the bombs were wrong, the torpedoes were wrong, and time was slipping through their fingers like water. At 0728 hours, the morning's deadly calculus shifted again. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone, launched late due to catapult problems, finally reported what Nagumo had dreaded. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. The Americans weren't cowering at Pearl Harbor after all. They were here, spoiling for a fight. Nagumo's dilemma deepened into crisis. Should he launch his half-ready aircraft immediately against this newly discovered threat, or wait for proper preparation? Vice Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the aggressive commander of Carrier Division 2 aboard Hiryu, urged immediate action. Through flag signals, he pleaded with Nagumo to launch everything available before the Americans could strike first. But Nagumo, methodical and cautious, hesitated. The Japanese admiral's hesitation proved catastrophic when, at 0745 hours, the scout plane transmitted an addendum that sent shockwaves through the fleet. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Now Nagumo knew he faced not just American cruisers and destroyers, but the carrier-based aircraft that could destroy his entire fleet. These communications intercepts and tactical decisions are documented in the official Japanese Naval War Diary, translated and archived by the U.S. Navy Historical Center. The order came down at 0715 hours. Stop rearming for the land attack. Begin rearming for anti-ship operations. But this meant returning the high-explosive bombs to the magazines and bringing up the armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes again. On every carrier, ordnance crews worked with desperate efficiency, but the complex process would take at least an hour, time they didn't have. Meanwhile, Tomonaga's first strike force was returning from Midway, many aircraft damaged and low on fuel. They needed to land immediately, which meant clearing the flight decks of any aircraft preparing to launch. The carriers found themselves trapped in a tactical nightmare. Aircraft needing to land, aircraft preparing to launch, and bombs and torpedoes, scattered across hangar decks that should have been clear for safety. At 0820 hours, the first wave of American attackers appeared on the horizon. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had found the Japanese fleet through navigation and sheer determination. Waldron's 15 Devastator torpedo bombers, flying without fighter escort, began their attack runs against impossible odds. The slow, obsolete aircraft became sitting ducks for the Japanese combat air patrol of Zero fighters. One by one, the Devastators fell into the sea under the guns of Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya's Zeros. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 American torpedo bombers had been shot down, their crews lost in the blue Pacific waters. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life vest and witnessing the battle from the ocean's surface. The attack had been a tactical disaster, achieving no hits on the Japanese carriers. But Torpedo Squadron 8 had accomplished something far more valuable than they knew. They had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the carriers vulnerable to attack from above. As the last Devastator spiraled into the sea, high overhead, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers were approaching their pushover points, completely undetected by the Japanese radar operators who were focused on the low-level torpedo attacks. The trap within a trap was about to spring closed with devastating effect. The moment that would define the Pacific War began at precisely 10:24 hours, when Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from the Enterprise rolled into their attacks on the Japanese carriers. McCluskey had been searching the empty ocean for over an hour, his fuel running dangerously low, when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. Following that white line of foam, he discovered Admiral Nagumo's entire carrier. Force spread out below like ships on a gaming table. What McCluskey saw would have been a dream target for any naval aviator. 4 aircraft carriers caught completely unprepared, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being hastily rearmed and refueled. The Akagi and Kaga steamed in formation to the south, while Soryu and Hiryu maintained position to the north. Bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines lay scattered across every hangar deck, a recipe for catastrophic secondary explosions. The Japanese had been caught at the worst possible moment. Tomonaga's returning aircraft from the Midway strike were still landing, while the second wave sat on the hangar decks with their ordnance changes only half complete. The combat air patrol of Zero fighters, having just finished slaughtering Torpedo, Squadron 8, were still at sea level and out of position. Admiral Nagumo's carriers were as vulnerable as they would ever be. McCluskey split his force, leading half his dive bombers against the Kaga, while his wingman, Lieutenant Richard Best, took the remainder against the Akagi. At the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from the Yorktown were beginning their attack on the Soryu. 3 American bomber squadrons had arrived simultaneously over the Japanese fleet, completely undetected, until they pushed over into their dives. The precise timing and coordination of these attacks is documented in the U.S. Navy's official battle report, filed with the Office of Naval Operations in July 1942. The first bomb to find its target struck the Akagi at 10:26 hours. Lieutenant Best's 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck near the aircraft elevator, detonating among the rearming aircraft below. The explosion triggered a chain reaction as aviation gasoline ignited, spreading fire throughout the hangar deck. Within minutes, Admiral Nagumo's flagship was transformed from a proud carrier into a floating inferno. On the Kaga, McCluskey's dive bombers achieved devastating accuracy. 4 direct hits turned the carrier's flight deck into a twisted mass of steel and flame. The ship's magazines began cooking off in secondary explosions that could be heard 20 miles away. Captain Jisaku Okada tried desperately to save his ship, but the fires were already beyond control. The Soryu suffered an equally devastating fate under Lieutenant Commander Leslie's attack. 3 bombs struck in rapid succession, igniting the aircraft fuel and munitions on the hangar deck. Captain Ryusaku Yanagamoto ordered his crew to abandon ship as explosions racked the carrier from stem to stern. The proud vessel that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack was dying in a maelstrom of fire and smoke. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers had been reduced to blazing wrecks. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, aircraft, pilots, and ships that had taken years to build and train was disappearing beneath the Pacific swells. The strike force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months had been virtually annihilated in the time it takes to smoke a cigarette. Only the Hiryu, steaming several miles north of the main formation, had escaped the American dive bomber attacks. Vice Admiral Yamaguchi, the fighter who had urged Nagumo to attack earlier, now faced a terrible decision: retreat and save his remaining carrier, or stay and fight against overwhelming odds in a desperate bid to salvage something from the disaster. The proud samurai chose to fight. Vice Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, watching towering columns of black smoke mark the funeral pyres of 3 Japanese carriers on the southern horizon. The aggressive commander of Carrier Division 2 had always been considered the most Western-minded of Japan's admirals, and now he faced a decision that would define his legacy. With the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burning wrecks, his single carrier represented the last hope of salvaging anything from the disaster at Midway. "Launch everything we have," Yamaguchi ordered his air staff. "If we must die today, we will take American ships with us to the bottom." At 1100 hours, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters off the Hiryu's deck, their destination the American task force that had just delivered such devastating punishment. Yamaguchi had chosen to attack, rather than retreat, embodying the warrior spirit that had made the Imperial Navy legendary. His pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, flew with the desperation of men who knew they were likely making their final flight. The target they sought was Task Force 17, centered around the carrier Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher. The Yorktown had already survived one major battle at Coral Sea the previous month and bore scars from that earlier engagement. Her skilled damage control teams had worked miracles to get her combat ready in time for Midway, but those hasty, Repairs were about to be tested under the most extreme conditions. At 12:10 hours, Kobayashi's dive bombers found their target. Despite fierce anti-aircraft fire from the American task force, 3 bombs struck the Yorktown in rapid succession. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, starting fires among the parked aircraft. The second bomb destroyed the ship's uptakes, reducing her speed to 6 knots and leaving her dead in the water. The third bomb caused additional damage to the flight deck, putting the carrier temporarily out of action. These damage reports are compiled from the official U.S. Navy War damage reports maintained in the archives at the Washington Navy Yard, but the Americans had learned the art of damage control from hard experience. Within an hour, the Yorktown's repair parties had the fires under control and the ship making 20 knots again. To Japanese observers, she appeared to be a different carrier entirely, leading them to believe they faced more American carriers than actually existed. Yamaguchi, still unaware that he faced 3 American carriers rather than the 2 he had initially estimated, prepared his second and final strike. At 13:30 hours, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the morning's strike on Midway, took off again in a damaged aircraft. His fuel tank had been holed by ground fire over Midway, but the veteran pilot volunteered for what everyone knew was a suicide mission. Tominaga's 10 torpedo bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters, represented the last offensive capability of the Japanese carrier force. As they disappeared over the eastern horizon, the men aboard Hiryu knew they were watching the final act of a drama that had begun with such promise at Pearl Harbor 7 months earlier. The attack achieved what seemed impossible. Tominaga's torpedo bombers, pressing home their attacks with fanatical determination, managed to put 2 torpedoes into the Yorktown's port side. The massive explosions knocked out the carrier's electrical power and caused a severe list that forced her crew to abandon ship. For a brief moment, it appeared the Japanese might have evened the score. But appearances in naval warfare can be deceiving. Even as the Yorktown lay listing and apparently finished, Admiral Spruance was preparing the counterstroke that would eliminate the last Japanese carrier and complete the victory at Midway. The Hiryu, having exhausted her offensive capability, now faced the full fury of American revenge. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pacific as Admiral Raymond Spruance made the decision that would complete the destruction of the Japanese carrier force. With the Yorktown apparently finished and listing heavily to port, many commanders might have withdrawn to consolidate their gains. But Spruance, the methodical former cruiser captain, understood that warfare's greatest victories come from pressing advantages to their ultimate conclusion. At 14:30 hours, he ordered every available aircraft from the Enterprise and Hornet to launch against the Hiryu. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, leading Scouting Squadron 6, had the honor of commanding what would be the final act in the carrier battle. His 24 dive bombers, accompanied by fighters from both American carriers, represented overwhelming force against Yamaguchi's lone remaining ship. Vice Admiral Yamaguchi knew his fate was approaching. The Hiryu's radar operators had detected the incoming American strike while the aircraft were still 50 miles away. Unlike the morning's surprise attack, this assault would find the Japanese prepared, but preparation meant little when facing such overwhelming numbers. The Hiryu's combat air patrol consisted of just 7 Zero fighters, hopelessly outnumbered by the approaching American formation. The attack began at 17:05 hours as Gallagher's dive bombers rolled into their attack dives from 14,000 feet. The Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts of flak, and her remaining Zeros fought desperately to break up the American formation. But the outcome was never in doubt. The Americans had achieved the concentration of force that military theorists called decisive superiority. 4 direct hits transformed the Hiryu from a proud warship into a blazing wreck within minutes. The Tao first bomb struck near the forward elevator, while subsequent hits devastated the flight deck and hangar spaces. Unlike the morning attacks on her sister ships, these bombs found a carrier with minimal aviation gasoline and ordnance aboard. The Hiryu had expended most of her dangerous materials in the day's 2 strikes. This actually prolonged her agony as she burned slowly rather than exploding catastrophically. The attack sequence and damage assessment are detailed in the U.S. Navy's combat narrative of the Battle of Midway, published by the Office of Naval Operations in 1943. Captain Tomeo Kaku fought heroically to save his ship, but by 1800 hours it was clear the Hiryu was doomed. Admiral Yamaguchi, the man who had urged aggressive action throughout the day, now faced the ultimate consequence of his warrior philosophy. Rather than transfer to another ship, he chose to remain aboard the dying carrier with his captain and crew. As evening approached, the full scope of the Japanese disaster became clear. In a single day, Admiral Nagumo had lost 4 aircraft carriers, over 200 aircraft, and most critically, the experienced pilots who had made those carriers effective. The men floating in life rafts around the burning hulks represented years of training and combat experience that Japan could never replace. Admiral Yamamoto, still approaching from the northwest with his battleships, received the devastating reports with growing disbelief. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor and orchestrated Japan's early victories now faced the reality that his entire strategic concept had collapsed. The decisive battle he had sought to force upon the Americans had indeed been decisive, but not in the way he had imagined. At 2300 hours, Yamamoto made the hardest decision of his naval career. Occupation of Midway is canceled. The most powerful fleet Japan had ever assembled began its retreat toward home waters, leaving behind the burning remains of their naval aviation and their dreams of Pacific dominance. The circle that had begun with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was closing, and Japan was now on the inside, surrounded by the awakening industrial might of America. Dawn broke on June 5, 1942, revealing a Pacific Ocean littered with the debris of Japanese ambitions. The 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, now lay on the ocean floor 2 miles beneath the surface, taking with them the myth of Japanese invincibility that had sustained the empire's early conquests. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Japan's naval strategy, stood in his quarters aboard the Yamato, staring at reports that read like a catalog of disasters. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. 4 aircraft carriers sunk, 1 heavy cruiser lost, over 300 aircraft destroyed, and more than 3,000 trained naval personnel dead or missing. Against this, the Americans had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and fewer than 150 men. The exchange rate was so lopsided that Japanese naval headquarters initially refused to believe the reports, demanding confirmation that could never come from the officers and pilots now resting in their steel tombs. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the hero of Pearl Harbor, who had been hospitalized with appendicitis and missed the battle, later wrote that Midway represented the beginning of the end for Japanese naval power. The pilots lost at Midway were irreplaceable, men with hundreds of hours of combat experience who had perfected their skills in campaigns from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. Japan's training programs, designed for a short war of decisive battles, could produce new pilots but could never replace the institutional knowledge that had died with the carriers. This assessment draws from Fuchida's post-war memoir, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, published by the U.S. Naval Institute in 1955. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood immediately that he had witnessed a turning point in naval history. The intelligence breakthrough that had made the victory possible, Commander Rochefort's code-breaking triumph, had proven that superior information could overcome superior numbers. More importantly, the battle had demonstrated that American industrial capacity, given time to mobilize, would eventually prove decisive in any extended conflict. The strategic implications rippled across the Pacific theater immediately. Japan's planned offensive operations, the invasion of New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa that would have severed the lifeline between America and Australia, died with the carriers at Midway. Instead of expanding their defensive perimeter, the Japanese found themselves forced into a defensive posture they were ill-equipped to maintain. The initiative in the Pacific War had passed permanently to the United States. Vice Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi and Captain Tomeo Kaku of the Hiryu chose death over dishonor, going down with their ship as she slipped beneath the waves at 0900 hours on June 5th. Their sacrifice embodied the warrior ethos that had made the Imperial Navy formidable, but also revealed the fatal flaw in Japanese strategic thinking: the belief that spiritual determination could overcome material disadvantages indefinitely. Admiral Yamamoto himself would not survive to see the ultimate consequences of Midway. Exactly 11 months later, American fighters would shoot down his transport aircraft over Bougainville, guided by the same intelligence-gathering capabilities that had made the Midway victory possible. His death would symbolize the complete reversal of fortunes that began in those 5 decisive minutes on June 4th. The Battle of Midway proved that underestimating one's opponent, whether in terms of fighting spirit, technological capability, or strategic intelligence, carries consequences that can determine the fate of nations. The Japanese High Command's fatal miscalculation had cost them not just ships and planes, but the strategic initiative that had carried them from Pearl Harbor to the gates of Australia. In steel and shattered pride, they had paid the ultimate price for their arrogance. The road from Midway led inexorably to Tokyo Bay, where Admiral Yamamoto's successors would surrender aboard the battleship Missouri 3 years later. The decisive battle Japan had sought to win had instead sealed their doom, beginning the long retreat that would end with the rising sun flag being lowered for the final time over the Empire's conquered territories.